First of all, I will introduce myself. My name is Amir. I'm General Secretary of QSAP Saudi Arabia chapter, and I'm currently working as a senior cost manager with one of the consultancy firm, Minard Group in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. For any of the new attendees, let me introduce about QSAP. That QSAP stands for the Quantity Surveyors Association of Pakistan. We have more than 1,200 members in more than 6 countries, including Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, UAE, Qatar, Oman, and Canada. We are a non-profit organization and believe in free knowledge sharing. Videos of our first webinar is uploaded on our YouTube channel already, and the presentation slides for today's webinar will be available on our LinkedIn page by tomorrow. It's worth mentioning that all of our events are free of charge and available for audience to gain the knowledge. Today is our 22nd webinar, which is the 5th webinar of Module 1 as part of 3-module series. This module provides valuable insights and information on the understanding the basic principle of project finance in public-private partnership. And before we move further, I would like to just make a couple of announcements that we will share a form in the chat box. You can fill the form if you want to get the attendance certificate. And then if anybody have any question, you can post those questions in the chat box, and those questions will be answered by end of the webinar. We will try to cover maximum questions within the 10 minutes, and any of the remaining questions will be entertained after the webinar. Now, let me introduce our respected speaker, Mr. Abdullahi Sheikh. Mr. Abdullahi Sheikh is working as a design and process manager in the development department of Mihona Company, which is one of the leading local water and wastewater developer, investor, and operator in Saudi Arabia. He brings about 18 years of diversified experience in water and wastewater treatment sector and wet utilities as a process specialist and project development lead, with proven track record of managing techno-commercial aspects. Abdullahi he has successfully delivered various development projects from inception stage to the financial close. And he is primarily a civil engineer, holds a master degree in environmental engineering, and he is PMP certified from PMI as well. Today, he will deliver the 5th lecture on the basic principle of project finance. So please warmly welcome with me, Mr. Abdullahi. Mr. Abdullahi, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you much, Amir, for such an overwhelming introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank the QSAP Forum for consistently organizing these webinars. And we have been hosting it quite consistently. I must appreciate QSAP for such kind of webinar organization. Second, I will again thank all the audience for attending this webinar. Of course, you have been sparing your precious time, and now it's my responsibility to ensure that what time you are spending is valuable. Today is the last webinar of our first module, is webinar number 5. And in this webinar, primarily we are going to talk about in detail the public procurement process in public-private partnership related projects. So if we start considering our webinar series, we had been discussing in the past that it would be primarily a 3-module series. So in 3-module series, it was the first module of its nature, and it's going to end today. We already had delivered the first webinar about the introduction of project finance. We have discussed in detail in lecture number 2 about working with lenders, and then lecture number 3 and 4, they were primarily detailing the role of external advisors, and today is our main lecture. And this webinar primarily will cover the overall public procurement processes, and we will go through all the components one by one. But before I start my lecture number 5, as usual, I will take you through the summary of some of the webinars that we had discussed previously to ensure that you refresh your mind. And once we start our webinar number 5, you quite have a good understanding and you are listening with a refreshed mind. In webinar number 1, we primarily discussed about the concept of a project finance, and we clearly mentioned that project finance is basically a cash flow driven kind of project financing, and the feasibility of the project primarily depends on the cash flows, And once these cash flows are generated, they cover the cost of the debt and they pay back to the sponsors as well as any principal amounts and interests to the lenders. We also discussed in detail that this is a non-recourse kind of financing, and in this non-recourse kind of financing, sponsors do not normally have to guarantee the repayment of the debt, and the lenders can only retrieve their money from the cash flows, and they can only have an access to the assets owned by the project company and not those assets which are owned by the sponsors. We also had discussed about the leverage, and we had drawn two main conclusions. One conclusion was that high leverage will improve the return of investor. So as an investor, I would tend to go with a high leverage because the debt is cheaper than the equity which I am going to spend as an investor. We also discussed that the leverage, going with a high leverage, the commodity price will go down, and higher the leverage, the more competitive the commodity price will become. So most of the time, whenever I will be going with the project finance, I will try to go with a high leverage consideration. We also discussed in webinar number 1 that why to use the project finance. And one of the key reasons was that the parties with different financial strengths, they can work together, and there is an independent due diligence exercised by lenders which ensure that project is viable and the risks are transferred to all those who can best manage it. And one of the key advantage for a developing country is that it will provide an additional funding for investment in the public sector, which might not be otherwise available. We also discussed the typical financial structures. One of the type of the financing was a kind of off-take contract where there is an input from one side and there is an output on the other side. So that output is being procured by a contracting agency as an off-take. And there are another type of financing structure, which are primarily the concessions. And these concessions typically relate to the public infrastructure, where the infrastructure is being used by public, and in turn this infrastructure, the payments are being collected for its use in terms of either user charges or the service fee. And the core bottlenecks we discussed in webinar number 1 was that the priority remains with the lenders. Any money being generated after any O&M costs will first go to the lenders, and then it will go back to the sponsor. So sponsors are a second tier receiver of any cash flow that are being received. In project finance also we discussed is a very slow process. The due diligence process takes a lot of time, and this creates some kind of frustration for the developer because developers, they want to finish all these things as soon as possible. And it also restricts the decision making of the sponsors because lenders make a tight control on the overall activities of the project company. Then in webinar number 2, we discussed on the source of financing, what could be the main source of financing. We discussed about two major sources. One were the banks, other were the bonds. And those banks could be multiple sort of banks. They can be commercial banks, development banks, export credit agencies, but the commercial banks are normally the most common lender. And in some large scale projects, when the loans are quite hefty in amount, they may not be managed by one bank. So few more banks come in and they form a syndicate and they nominate one agent bank, and they act as a communication channel between the project company and the bank. And the alternative source of funding could also be bond, where the project company can issue bonds to the public, and by issuing the bond, they commit to pay the periodic coupons and repay the capital amount on maturity of these bonds. And they are typically purchased by institutional investors. That could be pension funds, insurance companies, and they remain a tradable instrument from one hand to another hand. And typically to issue those bonds, the product company hires an investment bank who assist in structuring the overall project uh, and prepares a bond prospectus and issue the bond to the buyers. Typically, to engage those commercial banks, normally a preliminary information memorandum is issued, and this information memorandum, it contains all the key elements of the deal and invites through this information memorandum for banks to bid in a competition to underwrite the loan. And once the banks confirm their intention to underwrite the loan, normally a letter of intent is issued, and that is followed by a mandate letter, which confirms that these banks will be used at a later stage. And to have a consolidated deal with those banks, normally a financial term sheet is drawn, and by this way, the finance is underwritten. We also discussed about the life of the project in the project finance. There could be three phases: the development phase, construction phase, and operation phase. The development phase is the phase where the project is conceived and the equity and the debt, they are made available to the project company to withdraw and start the construction. And then comes in the construction phase where all the money is withdrawn and the project is built and is ready for operation. And in the operation phase, this is the phase where the project operates and produces cash flows to pay lenders and the investors accordingly. We also had discussed that when there are more than one investor, normally they sign a joint development agreement, which clearly defines the responsibilities of project development among those partners. And once the project goes into an execution stage and the project company is formed, this joint development agreement is changed to a shareholder agreement. We had discussed in detail the role of external advisors. One of the key reasons to hire those external advisors is that it will not be easy for the sponsors to develop a wider pipeline of projects because you will not find multidimensional professionals. So hiring the services of advisors helps the sponsors to conduct the overall process of project finance and PPP project. And once these advisors come with their own experience, it adds to the credibility of the project and lenders feel more comfortable and it typically expedites the process. What kind of advisors would be engaged in a public-private partnership kind of projects? We have detailed legal advisors. The legal advisors, they are primarily engaged in the structuring of the overall project, and they ensure that the risks are mitigated. And once the risks are mitigated, the forecasted cash flows are reliable and they have a sound link with the financial model, and they can be achieved in practical once the product goes into an operation. So what were their roles in pre-bid stage? Normally, they facilitate the joint development agreements. They provide pre-submission markups. They negotiate the term sheets with the counterparties. They are EPC term sheets, O&M term sheets. And the most important, they prepare a due diligence report. And in this due diligence report, they primarily highlight the risks engaged in this project and how these risks are allocated. In the post-bid stage, typically they negotiate the project agreements, they assist in organizing the project company, and they obtain necessary permits, and they provide operational teams with the know-how of contractual obligations by providing certain kind of contract manuals and handbooks. Similarly, we have discussed the role of financial advisors. The financial advisors, they are engaged to ensure that the finance deal is structured in a way that is acceptable to the banking market. So their role primarily is to issue a preliminary information memorandum to the banks, and then they conduct market sounding, and then they negotiate with the banks for any competitive financing. They advise the sponsors on the sources of financing and the strategy of optimum financing. And then they develop and revise the financial models and any financing arrangements which are required for senior debt and EBL. They do such kind of things to facilitate all these sponsors. Post bid, if there are any clarifications from the client, normally they help to respond to these clarifications, and they refine the financial model, and they assist sponsors in negotiating and finalizing all these financing documents which are required to ensure that the debt and the equity is in place. And then they assist the sponsors in achieving all condition precedents which are required to achieve the financial close, and they assist and negotiate the execution of all documents which are required for hedging. Similarly, the lender's technical advisors, we also discussed, they are very crucial in terms of their advice to the banks. They provide an opinion on the feasibility of the project, and they primarily safeguard the lenders because they are putting up money. So they act as a safeguard to the lenders. What they do typically, they conduct a due diligence exercise, and based on their due diligence, they give their opinion on the reliability of the technologies. They look at the risks available, the risks engaged with the technologies, the assumptions made in terms of the finances, the cash flows, whether the construction milestones they are reasonable, and what condition precedent should be achieved and the reasonability of that. During the construction phase, on behalf of lenders, they review all the requests which are generated by the EPC contractor to disperse the payment, and they look at the progress of against the disbursement request, and they issue the drawdown certificate based on which the payments are issued, and they look at the actual spend versus the forecasted budget. And then once the works are completed, they issue the final certificate of completion. And during the commissioning stage, they engage themselves in the testing and commissioning and the issuance of the final acceptance certificate. And once the product goes into operation, they conduct periodic site visits, and they evaluate the operational performance, and they maintain a check on the contractual agreements, whether they are maintained in the true essence or not. They look at the operational budgets, and they periodically issues the monitoring reports to the lenders to ensure that the projects are being operated in line with the assumptions made during the execution stage. We also discussed the role of insurance advisor in detail. Typically, their role is to ensure that insurance provisions are adequate, and this is one of the key criteria. The lenders will be looking to ensure that the project is bankable, and then they issue multiple reports during various stages of the project. It could be a financial close, prior financial close, they issue their report, and before the commercial operation date, they also issue a report. What kind of insurance are typically required? We have discussed in detail. There are many insurances. There could be construction all risk insurance, delay in startup, employer's liability, cargo, sabotage, and environmental insurance. Similar kind of insurance regime is being maintained in the operational phase, and all these insurances, they are maintained over the period of contract term. We also discussed the role of environmental advisors. What's their primarily role is to conduct the environmental and social impact assessment. Why? Because these are one of the legal requirements in most of the countries, and also lenders, they have signed certain treaties by which the ESIA has to be conducted, and the aim is to get the permits to initiate the construction, as well as they need operational permits, and they renew on timely basis. Okay, so we have gone through briefly on our previous webinars, and now comes our main webinar number 5. What we are going to discuss today are 10 core components. We will have a fair discussion on the public-private partnerships. What are the common PPP models used in the public-private partnership regime? What are the typical stages of the bidding? What is the request of qualification being sent by the contracting authority? And what are the typical responses of sponsors by issuing the statement of qualification? And then how the contracting agency would send a request for proposal, and what is typical bidder's response to such a request for proposals, and then how the contracting agencies shortlist the nominated or the preferred bidders, and what are the conditions which must be satisfied before the project goes into execution, and how the payment is made over the contract term. So as you have been engaged with these kind of projects, I'm confident you might have a fair idea of typical bidding structure. But I'm I'm sure that once we will go through this, it could be an easy piece of cake for you to digest. But there could be few more new terminologies that you might not have heard in a common EPC contract. So let's go and discuss in detail. So what is happening in a common PPP project? Typically, these are large scale projects. So the high chance is that these large scale projects must be initiated by some public sector, and the public authorities, they could be the one who could conceive the project that would be required, and there could be some ministerial approvals obtained for certain projects to be built in future, and accordingly the government agencies, they make their own boards. So a board is made to review several projects and to ensure that which project has most benefit to cost analysis and which project could be initiated. So after these formal reviews and approvals that are being obtained by the project board from the Ministry of Finance or any other relative public agencies, developers are typically asked to build these kind of projects and operate them. So public-private partnership is a mutual arrangement between the public sector, which are mostly contracting authorities, and the private sector, which are mostly sponsors and private developers. So this arrangement engages both the public sector and the private sector to deliver the required services that are being conceived by the government. So what happens basically, once the public sector joins hand with the private sector and they formulate a proper partnership to execute and operate the job, we reach to public-private partnership. Now, what happens that how this public-private partnership should be initiated? What happens is that public authority is normally the one who initiates the overall process. What they do, they have a series of projects on board, and then they decide based on the strategy they have that which one should move ahead based on the ministerial approvals and based on the benefit and cost analysis. So once they confirm that a certain project has to be executed and it fits into the strategy of the government and is suitable for its procurement as a PPP, they do an initial business case. This outline business case is basically to assess whether the project, if they are going to build on PPP basis, is affordable or not. So during this assessment of affordability of that project on PPP basis, they assess the scope of the project, what are the capital expenditures required, and what are the operational costs required to operate these plants over a certain term of the contract, and what is the cost of the finance. So they already have an higher level assessment of the components of operating costs, capital expenditures, and the financing cost, and they plug in a shadow bid model to come up with a high level tariff or the cost of the product to ensure whether it makes sense to go with this project or not. So once they develop a shadow model and they come up with an anticipated cost of the product that would normally be given by the bidders and is being affordable to the government sector, what they do, then they approach the market to, to test whether the project that they assume could be constructed on a PPP basis is readiness in terms of the market. So once they approach the market to test the readiness of the developers, basically they are looking the appetite of the developers, whether the project they are having on board, the developers are interested to bid for such kind of projects, and whether they are bankable or not, and they can attract the attention of the lenders or not. So after they select the project, develop the business case, establish the affordability of such project, they are going to the market to test whether the developers are interested to proceed and whether the banks they are interested to lend money or not. So once this exercise is done, typically then developers role is to start, but there could be some bottlenecks, and those bottlenecks could be, even though the banks are willing to execute the project and there are developers in the market who could construct it and operate it, there could be many risks involved in executing this. There could be political reasons which may be an obstacle to construct these kind of projects. There might be some social unacceptance where the public might not be willing for such projects to be executed in their area. There could be some environmental risks and there could be some market risks where the public sector might not be willing to pay a certain amount against the commodity. Public sector or public authority normally assumes all these risks and confirms to the developers that such risks remain an obligation of public authority and they will protect the public developer against such kind of risks. So then once all these sureties are made, then public developer comes in and raises a long-term debt for the project and they communicate with the banks and they get proper lending against the project and they start generating the cash flow from the project. So during this course, once they have raised the debt funding, they normally hire an EPC contractor who will procure the services of design, and this EPC contractor will construct, and then the developer will come in to operate it and maintain it. And of course, this operation and maintenance is against certain KPIs, which provides the product or services to the required standards which are required by the public authority. And then this sector is being paid for these outputs which are generated by the developer. So once public authority makes its job done and the private developer starts creating the necessary indicators and produces the necessary outputs, it helps to have a win-win situation for both the public authority and the developer. And what do you mean by win-win situation? That there are many risks which are being absorbed by public authority because they are the best who could protect the product company for the risks which product company cannot handle. And at the same time, product company takes certain risks of construction and operation, which could be an issue for public authority. So this appropriate risk sharing among the partners generate a win-win situation. And of course, the private developers, when they come in, they bring innovations and they are in a better shape to manage the infrastructure and bring efficiency to the overall project and expertise that is required with necessary skills and reducing the overall downtimes of the project. So this was a brief introduction of what is an obligation in terms of a PPP for public sector and a private sector. Now the second question is, what should be the typical model of the PPP that should be adopted by the public authority? This mainly is governed by one core element, which is who will own the project. So who will own the project will define the basic PPP model. There could be several models, and there could be several acronyms used for these PPPs, but I will go through a very common set of PPP model. The first model that we can see is normally implemented in a PPP deal is BOT, which is called Build, Operate, and Transfer. What does it contains? In this PPP BOT model, the project company typically constructs the project and earns the revenue from its operation, but it cannot own the assets. It has no right to own the assets because these assets are typically the assets being used by the public, and they cannot be under the ownership of the project company. The typical examples could be roads, bridges, tunnels, ports, railways, metros. These remain under the ownership of the public authority and cannot be owned by the project company. So their role is primarily to build it, operate it, and then at the end of the contract, transfer it back. But we need to see one more thing. The lenders typically would require a kind of security, and that security is to have an occupation or control of these assets for a certain period of time, even though they are not owning it. So in this case, what happens? There is typically an agreement between the project company and the public authority whereby a lease is granted to the project company. And through this lease, they can have a control of the buildings and the equipment during the term of the project. So one of the terms that could be used in this case is also build, lease, and transfer. Or we can also mention that it can often be used at a different acronym: build, lease, operate, and transfer. The second model is boot, where the PPP is based on build, own, operate, and then transfer. The project company in this model constructs the project and has the physical ownership of all the assets of the project, and it operates for a certain set period of time, earns revenues, pays it back, and once the contract is finished, the ownership is transferred to the off-taker. The typical examples could be water treatment plants or sewage treatment plants. One thing here we need to see, in this kind of contracts, the ownership remains with the project company till the contract term is expired. Upon the expiry of the contract, the off-taker reverts this asset back to the public sector. So the kind of contracts and the assets that are therein are typically referred to as reverting assets. But if the off-taker is returning it back, it must be against a certain residual value. So once the contract is expired and the assets are returned back, there is a residual value that has to be paid by the public sector to the off-taker. And there are some requirements that the handover of the assets should be like that the public sector must be able to operate the handed over structures and assets at least for 5 years. There could be one more model that could be used on public-private partnership is build, own, and operate, but there is no transfer of those assets to the public sector. This could be typical power plants. The private companies can come in and they build the power plant and they can sell the power or mobile phone network. So the product company will sell their product or the services against a certain service fee or a certain charge, but they are never going to hand it back to the public authority because it was never owned by them. So these are typically called merchant projects, which are being owned by the private sector, and they remain the owner throughout the life of the project. There is one more kind of PPP model, and this model is lease, develop, and operate. Once you see the lease, develop, and operate, it should be considered as a privatization kind of model. And in this privatization kind of PPP model, there are already an existing structure which the public sector is already having the ownership. This public sector gives this the ownership for a certain period of time to the private sector so that private sector could use it, modernize it, expand it, and can generate cash flows and then repay the amount which public sector has which the private sector has given to the public sector. So these could be existing structures like the parks, like the public buildings, like airports. So the existing facilities can be given on lease to the private companies, and those private companies, they will pay a lump sum amount to the public sector, and this lump sum amount is then recovered back over a certain period of time. And once the lease period is over, those assets are returned back to the government. So there are many PPP models, but most common models that we will see in many of the projects are typically these four models. And most of the time, you will see that on an average, the concept of PPP lies and circulates among these four kind of models. Now, what happens? The bidding, once the project is being conceived and the lenders, they have shown their interest to bid for those jobs, and there is an appetite in the market, a legal requirement in most of the countries is to run a competitive process. And once they run a competitive process, based on that competitive process, there are series of evaluations stages that are being conducted by the public sector. And once there is a screening from one stage to another stage, what does it mean that with these kind of multiple evaluation stages and the screening of the bidders, normally some time is being spent, and as well as it makes the process a little bit expensive from both sides. So in PPP, excuse me, what is the typical bidding process? The typical bidding process is quite standard. There is an expression of interest. An expression of interest is being raised by the public sector, and they invite the interested parties through the necessary communication channels, either the websites or newspapers or any other communication channel, where they invite the interested parties to express their interest in participating in the PPP tender and listing down the details of their consortium partners. So once the expression of interest is being raised and there are certain companies showing their interest, and this information is compiled by the public sector, the next stage is to issue a request for qualification. Now, public sector, they have quite a handsome information about the interested parties, and not all parties may be eligible to go through the next step. So there is a qualification process. And in this qualification process, normally a request of qualification is issued by the public authority or a contracting agency with the predefined criteria, and any company who will follow those criteria are shortlisted based on their eligibility. Once the request for qualification is over and the shortlisted applicants are there with the public sector, those shortlisted companies are issued with a request for proposal. And based on that request for proposal, the bidders, they are requested to submit a comprehensive bid. And once this bid is submitted, those contracting agencies, they negotiate with the potential bidders about their best and final offer, and then they announce preferred bidder and a reserved bidder. And the selected one out of these preferred bidder and reserved bidders, which one is selected, normally follows a cycle of signing a development agreement. And this date on which a development agreement is signed is typically called as an effective date. So this is a common cycle, which is typically used in a PPP project. It's not that different from a conventional EPC, but there are many things which you will see could be different from a conventional EPC. Now, we have discussed expression of interest, request for qualification, and request for proposal, and shortlisting of potential candidates. The request of qualification, why this is required? One thing is that because both the bidders and the public authority, they spend considerable time and money in preparing the bids. Those bidders which are not qualified, they will have very little chance of winning those bids. And if they are not screened out of this qualification, what will happen that it will require a considerable time, and later they will not be the among the potential winning bidders. The second criteria is that few bidders can manage the process. For a public sector, the lesser are the number of bidders, it would be easy for the off-taker to follow a proper selection criteria and to evaluate the pre-qualified applicant who are technically sound as well as financial capability is there. So as a part of the request for qualification, off-taker or a contracting agency typically asks the bidders to go through 2 or 3 core qualification criteria. One is the financial qualification, and the second one is a technical qualification. In the financial qualification, what they do is that they ensure that each consortium member has a minimum net worth. And this net worth should be reflected in the audited financial statements, as well as they look at the financial capabilities that the potential sponsors should have some successful references, and they must show their ability to fund similar projects, and they must be able to demonstrate that they can raise the equity on non-recourse financing. And also at the time of executing the contract, they must be able to retain certain proportion of their share after the closing date. Similarly, the development experience of the developer is normally checked, that they have a satisfactory technical record and experience in successfully developing the project, as well as the O&M experiences, and they would have managed certain projects of similar scale, and they would be able to perform certain activities. So all these references are typically used, and the bidders, they respond to these qualification requests. And once the request for qualification is issued, bidders typically they submit their statement of qualification. And in that statement of qualification, because there are many requirements, technical capabilities, financial capabilities, must be able to run the operation and maintenance, must be able to finance. Not every sponsor might have a certain or all set of requirements fulfilled. So what they do, they typically form a consortium. And in this consortium, there could be 3 types of consortium members. One could be a lead member, and this lead member is acting as a main point of contact and manages the overall consortium. There could be a technical member who could bring in certain technical capacities to justify the technical requirements of the project, and there could be some financing company who could just finance and be a part of the consortium as a other member. So as a part of their statement of qualification in response to the request for qualification, Typically, they submit their corporate structure, and in this corporate structure, they are submitting the credit rating of the company, what could be the organization of the project, and what is the role and responsibility of each member if they are a consortium. Similarly, the financial strengths are being submitted as a part of the evaluation. So financial statements, which are balance sheets, income statement, cash flows, they are all submitted for the contracting authority to ensure that the company or the consortium is quite stable and can inject the required amount of equity. They are also described to mention that how they will manage the funds required to be invested in the project company and the commitments they will obtain from the banks. Their financial capabilities are also required and they are being submitted. So in this case, they mention that who are their potential lenders, what source of equity they are going to use, and what finance will be contributed by each party, and what they are in terms of their expectations for the commercial operational close. Similarly, they submit their technical capabilities, and in those technical capabilities, they submit the eligibility requirements and the references that would be required for the contracting agency to ensure that they are dealing with the right developer. Then, once the statement of qualification is submitted, there is a request for proposal. And in this request for proposal, normally many documents are shared by the contracting agency. One of the key documents is instruction to the bidders. This instruction to the bidders contains the overview of the project, conditions of the site, implementation schedule. Of course, for the bid, there must be some requirements that must be submitted as a part of the bid. So what bid bond will be required, the validity of these bid bonds, the validity of the bids, the criteria of evaluation, successful notification of the bidder, all of them, they are included in this kind of instruction to the bidders. And of course, this is a long-term project, so the mechanism how the company is going to be paid are defined, deductions are mentioned, and what assumptions they have to take while making their financial model is also defined. Nowadays, there are a lot of local content requirements. So what local content will be required from the developer is also specified. Insurance is required for the project. All of them, they are specified in the instruction to the bidders. Then one of the main document that is a part of RFP are the technical specifications. Normally, the contracting authority does not dictate the developer in terms of the selection of the technology or in terms of the typical design details, but they provide enough information which act as a guideline for all the bidders to submit their bid. So this contains the interfaces that would be considered in between the product company and the contracting agency, the design basis, redundancy requirements, how the compliance in terms of the output should be monitored, and what are the typical reporting requirements. Most of the clients, to facilitate the developers, they conduct several studies beforehand and they make it part of their RFP. This could be topographic surveys, geotechnical studies, environmental baselines. All of these are typically a part of technical specifications. And then they also share with the developer some kind of agreements that if a project is awarded to a certain developer, what agreements has to be signed and what are the typical clauses therein, so that bidders must have a beforehand information of the typical clauses of the contract they are going to sign. There could be multiple agreements. There could be credit support agreement, usufruct or land lease agreement, direct agreement. So they are all part of this. Similarly, the templates in which the bidder has to submit their model, and all these financial related templates are made available as a part of this Now, once the bidder receives the RFP with all the details being shared by the contracting agency, what they do is they start preparing to respond to the RFP. So any consortium that they have built in the past, they finalize their agreements to ensure that they are submitting the bid as one consortium. They execute any joint development agreements among the sponsors, and then they formulate the team who is going to prepare and submit the bid. Of course, there is a budget that has to be assigned, and then they list subcontractors and advisors that they are planning to hire to run through the overall process of bidding, and then they communicate through their financial advisors in the market and they select the banks. And then similarly, clarifications, site visits, job explanations, due diligence, and markups, all of them are part of their bid submission. So once they submit their bid, there are many volumes that would need to be submitted as a part of the bid. The first volume that is normally required contains bid bond, the power of attorneys, cover letters, financial statements, certificates, the organization chart of the product company, and how this product company is going to operate. Then comes another volume that specifies the commitments in terms of the banks that they will be committed if the project is awarded to the prospective sponsor, the term sheets agreed between the banks, how the project will be financed, what are the costs or the tariff or the charge rate, and the model that they are submitting must be audited by some third party auditor. So there are letters to be submitted, the assumptions, calculations, the insurances, and all of these things they are submitted as a part of their bid submission. Similarly, their design solution, which is a technical submission, all the drawings, calculations, how the product will be controlled, guarantees, equipment data sheets, they are made a part of the bid. And the implementation schedules, milestones, organizations, plans, all of them, they form the basis. And one thing, because there are draft agreements being shared by the off-taker to the sponsors, typically they look at those contract agreements and where they have any reservations or concerns, they mark it up and they submit as a part of their overall bid. So once this bid is submitted, then it comes the off-taker whose role is to shortlist the prospective bidder. So what that off-taker normally does. So evaluation methodology is quite simple. Their first criteria is to assess the bid for its completeness. There are many conveyance letters and there are many checklists and many bid requirements which has to be validated by the contracting agency whether they have been submitted or not. And the second thing they look at whether there is any material non-compliance which will make the overall bid nullified, null and void. They also look at that, and if they found that some of the bidders they have material non-compliance in terms of the bid submission, they demand certain clarifications. And then there is a detailed bid evaluation criteria they follow, and then based on that, they rank the bids and they shortlist it, and they define the preferred bidder that they are intending to communicate with. At the same time, the reserve bidder that in case if they fail to negotiate with, that reserve bidder is also defined in the similar shortlisting and nomination. So what is their criteria? First criteria, of course, is a financial compliance. The bidder, as a part of their submission, they submit the bid models and they submit the costing information. So the off-taker normally reviews the accuracy of the bidder's model in line with the assumptions that they have submitted in the bid. They also see whether the costs which have been submitted by the bidder are consistent throughout and they are in line with off-taker's evaluation model. Remember, bidder also has a financial model, as well as the off-taker also has a financial model. As a part of the RFP, off-takers normally share these models so that bidders could take it up and use them as a main source and submit their financial model accordingly. So once their financial model is submitted, the off-taker also evaluates the outputs are in line with the outputs that off-taker is having based on the similar inputs. Similarly, there must be a letter which should guarantee that there has been an audit and all the links and each and everything is fine. There should be a minimum committed funding required from most of the contracting agencies. So there is a check whether the sponsors they are committing to a certain leverage or debt financing or not. Similarly, there are term sheets, whether they are complete or not, whether the financing plan which is put in place by the sponsor is achievable, is it appropriate, the insurances are placed, and the likelihood that whatever bidder's financial plan could be within the timeline of the implementation schedule. So all of these things are first checked by the financial advisors of the contracting agency to ensure that all the financial elements are aligned. And then they look at the legal compliance status, that whether the EPC contractors or the O&M contractors being used by those lenders, by those sponsors, they are legally qualified. And they look at the markups which are being raised by sponsors, as well as they look at the terms and conditions of the funding and the degree of commitment to the financial parties. Another aspect which developers are required to comply with is the technical compliance. So the contracting agency look at the eligibility of the EPC contractor and the O&M contractor, whether they are suitable to execute such kind of jobs. And similarly, there are certain minimum functional specifications and performance requirements of off-taker. So they are cross-checked that bidders and off-takers requirements are aligned and bidder is complying with the requirements of RFP. The designs and treatment technologies are suitable. It is also being cross-checked. And of course, there will be certain requirements in terms of the efficiency. For example, there must not be an area more than a certain required area. The power consumption should not exceed a certain value. So there are certain efficiency guarantees and considerations demanded from the bidder, which are also used to cross-check and confirm whether they are there or not. And then local content is one of the emerging criterias of these bids. And then implementation schedule. So all of them are being cross-checked as the primary compliance criteria of the bidders. Then what happens once all these three elements, which are financial compliance, legal compliance, and technical compliance, they are cross-examined by the contracting agency, the off-taker normally chooses a preferred bidder, as well as one or two reserved bidders. Why they choose preferred bidder and reserve bidder at the same time? Because before signing the agreements, there are many conditions which has to be satisfied by that preferred bidder. And if that preferred bidder fails to satisfy those conditions, there is likely no agreement signed between the preferred bidder and the off-taker. So to have this issue resolved, they always keep few more bidders in the pipeline, that if the negotiation they fail with the preferred bidder, then they communicate with the second or third bidder to ensure that all the conditions precedent they are satisfied. And after all this shortlisting and communication and condition precedent resolution, one successful bidder is nominated, which is required to proceed and execute the project agreement. So once a successful bidder is nominated, their bid bond is being replaced by a development security. Before they sign an agreement, it's an obligation of the bidder that they replace their bid bond with a development security to an agreed amount of an EPC contract. And then once the contracts are signed, to achieve the financial close, there are many conditions which must be followed to ensure that the project can reach to its execution stage, and the banks, they are willing to pay all the money to be withdrawn for the execution. What are those condition precedents? The contract, so the off-taker has evaluated the bidders, they had nominated the preferred bidder, and they reached to a successful bidder, and they are close to sign a development agreement. And once this agreement is signed, it's not yet over. To have a financial close between the development agreement signature and the financial close, there are many documents to be provided as a requirement either from the off-taker or the lender to have the financial close. So the condition precedents are effectively a checklist of documents which are typically required by both the lenders and off-taker to ensure that the money is made available to be withdrawn by the project company. And if these condition precedents they are not satisfied, there is normally no financial close. And if there is no financial close, it means that the preferred bidder and the development agreement, even though it has been signed, it has of no value. What are those checklist of documents which are required prior financial close? First of all, these are the corporate documentation. Of course, the project company has to be formed. And this project company must have some article of associations, incorporations, commercial registration. So all of this must be made before the financial close. The JDA, which is Joint Development Agreement among the parties, must be replaced with a shareholder agreement, and it should be made a part of the checklist of the documents. There must be many resolutions by the board of directors to authorize that who is going to sign on behalf of the project company for the execution, delivery, and the performance activities. So all these corporate documents are required as a checklist before the financial close. Then there are many project documents. There are copies of the contract has to be submitted, guarantees, securities, permits, as well as notice to proceed for the construction contractor, and all these direct agreements which must be between the lenders and the contracting authorities should be made a part of the project documentation. And there is also financial documentation where there must be signed copies of all financing documents. There must be signed copies of the agreements that banks they have committed to lend the money. Any fees, any letters which are related to the fees for the underwriting, for the commitment, each and everything must also make a part of the financing documentation. And there are some security documentation to give lenders security on the assets. On top of that, lenders would require due diligence from their advisors. So as a part of the due diligence before the financial close, lenders advisors, they certify that there is an evidence that the investors who are the sponsors of the project, they have made their equity available to be withdrawn, or there is a certain commitment made available. So they ensure this, and then they look for the evidence that there are certain hedging arrangements or the interest swaps we will discuss in later modules. They have been placed and insurances are in place. So all these cross checks are made by the advisors, financial advisors. And similarly, there is also due diligence from the technical commercial perspectives. So the advisors of lenders, they give the reports. So lenders, engineers, insurance advisors, and any other advisors which are being hired by the lenders, they give their final reports on certain elements which are required by the lenders to be satisfied. So there are financial model auditor reports which are to be submitted, and there is a schedule that has to be validated by the consultants of the lender that they are the final and they will be extracted as per the drawdown schedule of the project. Similarly, there is a legal due diligence. Before the financial close, the legal advisors must give the legal opinion to the lenders that all these documents which have been made a part of the contract and the financial close are legally valid and their opinion is specified, and the confirmation that the product company which has been formed does not have any litigation. So once all these conditions or the checklists are satisfied and due diligence is made, the project is ready to withdraw the money from the lenders, and we call it the financial close. Now, one more concern is that what should be the mechanism to pay during the term of the contract? So, lenders or the contracting agencies, or if I will say the contracting agencies, they have to select one shortlisted bidder. And how they will select? And they are running the competitive process, and each company will come up with an operational cost which could vary from time to time. So this will have an issue for the contracting agency to to come up with a unified level of comparison. So what they typically ask is all the bidders to submit a levelized tariff, and this levelized tariff basically takes into consideration all the costs over the period of the term, the contract. It could be 20 years or 25 years, and then all these costs are converted into a net present value of today. So one levelized tariff is submitted by all bidders, and that levelized tariff is used as a decisive factor to nominate the preferred bidder. Now, once the bidder has been nominated and selection has been made, the second question is how they will be paid. We need to understand what are the typical components which has to be paid to the product company. One key component is a capital obligation. What are those capital obligations? The sponsors, they have arranged a debt from the banks. So they have to pay back the principal amount as well as they have to pay the interest. Similarly, sponsors, they have made money or injected money as an equity. They would also like to have the return as a dividend or distribution to the sponsors. And there are many taxes and levies and duties that have to be paid. On top of that, the project is going to operate for a long period of time. There are many fixed O&M expenses, whether the project is operating or not, they have to be paid. So what are those? These are the overheads. There is a managerial staff, there is an operating staff who is operating the plant. Similarly, the product company has to pay on yearly basis all the insurance premiums, so they have to be paid back. There are some scheduled maintenance. Apart from the output, the assets of the project must be maintained. So these are the costs that have to be paid. And the project company might have many agreements like pest control, like landscaping, like many service agreements, which are independent of the output of the project. On top of that, there are variable O&M expenses, which are directly related to the output. They have to be paid. For example, there are supplies, fuel. There are byproducts which are resulting from the input. So these are the variable costs. They have also to be paid. Electricity, as well as some other charges, which are the supplemental payment. There could be some regulatory fees which has to be paid, or there could be some change in laws which will be covered under supplemental payment. With so many components involved, some of them fixed, some of them variable, there is obviously a question, what is the best possible way for the off-taker to pay back to the product company? To have a best possible way of remuneration being paid to the product company or a sponsors, typically there is a tariff mechanism agreed among the sponsor and the contracting authority. What are those? We have discussed previously, there are majorly two types of contracts. One is an offtake contract. In the offtake contract, there is an input and there is an output. An example we discussed that, for example, in a wastewater treatment plant, domestic sewage is taken, processed, and is used as an output with a fine quality suitable for irrigation. So these type of the contracts we discussed, these are the offtake contracts. And these offtake contracts, typically, they are based on providing the offtaker with a secure supply of the required output. What are typical payment mechanisms in these kind of offtake contracts? One possible mechanism is take and pay. The contracting agency takes an output, for example, the electricity, and then pays for the product taken. But there is a greater risk that what if the contracting agency is not taking the product? Under this contract, the obligation of the contracting agency is to pay only once they take it. And there is no certainty that the product will be purchased. So most of the time, lenders do not accept it because there is a potential risk of non-payment in case the plant is ready to deliver, but the contracting agency is not going to take it. So there is another payment mechanism that could be take or pay. And that take or pay is that whether the off-taker takes or not the end product, off-taker must have to pay. Here, the risk of the lender is minimized because they will be paid in all cases. And now comes in a problem. The off-taker claims that why off-taker has to pay once the off-taker is not taking the product. So there is a hybrid kind of take or pay. In that case, there is a settlement made between the off-taker and the contracting off-taker and the product company. Okay, take or pay could be a hybrid structure. And what that hybrid structure we are going to discuss. The costs which are independent of the output and they must incur over the course of the contract must be paid by the off-taker irrespective of whether it purchases or not. So any fixed costs which are incurred by the product company must be paid by the off-taker irrespective of whether it takes or not the product. And the variable cost will be subject to the condition that if the product company is asked by the off-taker to deliver a product, then the product company will be paid the fixed costs as well as variable costs. So there are some hybrid take or pay structures being agreed for such kind of contracts. And one of them, and one more payment mechanism that could happen is a sales contract. And in the sales contract, the off-taker agrees to take agreed upon quantities of the product, but the price is paid on the market rate. So they will always take it, but the price is not fixed, whatever is the market price. This is again not being accepted by most of the lenders. So a very common way of having payment settled among the off-taker and the contracting agency are take or pay. And this take or pay is not not something open. There is a hybrid structure where each party goes with a win-win situation. And now we are going to discuss those costs. Okay. Now, one of the core element is a fixed cost that has to go on irrespective of the output of the product. The second is the variable cost that highly depends on the product being taken or not and is directly proportional to the output. The third is the energy charge. Every product will or every asset will consume some electricity. So most of the clients, they come in and they say that why the sponsors would charge any margins over electricity, while this is a commodity being supplied by the government. So this portion is separated, and this energy charge is passed on, and whatever is the consumption is paid on actual. And then there are other supplemental costs. Of course, uh, if the product company is unable to deliver the product with required specifications, then there could be many deductions charged. So with all of this, the total service payment is a combination of fixed costs, variable costs, and other costs. So what are those costs? Basically, fixed cost, the debt is to be paid, the equity has to be returned, the fixed O&M costs, they have to be maintained. Similarly, there are variable costs, electricity, supplemental payments, and there are deductions. It could be performance deductions, environmental deductions, and additional deductions that would be paid. In infrastructure projects, you cannot follow the similar rule. So what happens in that case, the revenue in the concessions we discussed by user charges. So these are basically availability based contracts. In availability based contracts, there is a fees that is paid to the project company based on ensuring the availability of these assets. So these can be managed through user charges or service fees. User charges are normally collected from the user of the public, and it has a floor that if the usage is lower than the projection, the balance will be paid by the contracting agency. And in service fees, typically it's quite simple. There could be a hospital, there could be a school. It has to be made available, and against which a service fee has to be paid. So we are done with our presentation. It was a bit lengthy, and we are very close to finish our timeline. We have still 8 minutes. So please, Amir, I will take it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Abdul. Yet another very informative webinar. Thank you very much for your time. We'll just move with the questions. I have only two questions. From one of question is from Mr. Zulfkar. He's asking, can you please clarify the developer project company with some typical examples? This was related to the classification of PPP projects.
So the product company, whenever it has to be made, it normally takes two forms. Either it will be in the form of a joint stock company, JSC, or it could take the form of a limited liability company. So whenever the sponsors, they make a product company, typically they follow one of these structures.
Thank you. Another question is also from Zulfikar. He's saying that like in KSA, Ministry of Finance has created SAR, Saudi Arabian Railway project. Is this SAR a public or private authority? If you can shed a light.
This I'm not familiar with.
I believe this is a state-owned company. It's not a public or private, as per my information. So maybe you can later on search on the internet. Information is available there. This is all from the questions. Only we had two questions. Now I will request Mr. Babar Zahir, President QSAP Saudi Arabia chapter. Please, if you can say a few words on completing the module one of our three module series on PPP projects.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amir, and thank you very much, Mr. Abdul Hai. Really, we are really thankful that you have taken time out and completed the series of 5 webinars really on such a distant topic. We are really thankful of your patience and the depth of knowledge you have. Really, and also it's a very distant topic for most of the QSs. So you can imagine that you had only I think basically one question today. So actually people had some difficulty in understanding, but usually when we go for the EPC and some other QSing knowledge, so we always hear about PPP and bot and boot, but the way you have presented and the way you have explained, it's really commendable. And I'm really thankful of you on behalf of QSAP. I would really like to thank you for your for the effort you have done for us, and you came to our forum and you have explained. And inshallah, we'll be stay tuned for the next module,
All
inshallah.
right.
Yes, meanwhile,
So,
inshallah.
yes, Babar. So I was planning to give a bit of light on our upcoming module. In upcoming module, we
Yes,
are aiming to primarily discuss the contractual elements of project agreement. They are not like a typical EPC contract. There are early terminations, there are step-in rights, there are events of default, there are excuse events. So all these things we are going to discuss in our upcoming module, as well as we will discuss the risks involved in a PPP project and what are the typical allocations made to mitigate these risks. So upcoming module will primarily discuss the contractual elements and the risks and allocations.
that's really, I'm really glad to know that you will be talking on these topics. I think we as QSAs or contracts manager or cost managers, we can more relate to this aspect of PPP, because we understand some things, the way you have spoken some terminologies. So for sure it will be the attendees will develop a good understanding. Thank you very much. Thank you again, and
Yeah.
I would like to thank.
Babar Saab, if you,
Yeah,
sorry, allow
yeah,
me
please,
just
please,
for one,
please,
I
please.
mean, just take a 1 minute. Sorry,
Yes.
Saab, I just, try to hijack the show, but actually I could not resist myself to say again, to jump in and say thanks to you, because of course I didn't attend the full of your session, but yes, whenever I get time, I always attend your session. And really, I mean, as Babar Saab said, thank you so much on behalf of QSAP. I mean, you have really shared a very good knowledge with the audience. I mean, I myself, because we are not that much familiar with the PPP contract, we just know about it academically as our part of our procurement and I would say the route of the procurement of the competencies from the rigs. But I never experienced any PPP projects, and I'm really very keen to know more about it. And as you said, your next module will be focusing more on the contractual side of that PPP, which is really, I'm really looking forward to, enhance my own knowledge. And of course, our audience will get it. Definitely, they will get that knowledge from your webinar. So thank you so much once again from my side. I really want to say thanks, and and we're really looking forward to you for the next year module.
That's great of you.
Gentlemen, if yes, Amir sir, yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, please, yeah, if you want to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to. I think most of you know, maybe Mr. Lake Hassan. He's the chair of RICS in KSA, and also the chair of QSAP. So this was his introduction. Um, So I would like to thank also the QSAP KSA chapter. They have done a lot of effort for this complete series, and inshallah they will do it continuously for the next upcoming webinars. Not only for PPP, there are other sessions coming. So please stay tuned. Also the QSAP IT, QSAP KDC Knowledge Delivery Committee, and QSAP Admin Committee. So they have done a good job. Thank you very much, Amir Saab, and thank you very much, Mr. Abdullahi again. So, inshallah, we'll be stay tuned for your next module.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you,
you very
Babu
much.
Saab.
Thank you. Have a
And
nice day.
thank
See you
you,
later.
Laik Saab. Thank you, Abdullah Saab. I believe with us we have Mr. Imtiaz, President UAE for QSAP. He want to say a few words. So, Mr. Imtiaz, please, you can, if want to add anything.
Thank you very much, Amir. Thank you very much, Babar Saab, Laik Saab, for your nice comments. I was wanting to provide secondment to Babar Saab comments, but Laik Saab has already done. So really, it was a very nice and good program. Thank you very much, Abdul Saab. It was very much learning, as Laik Saab said, Babar Saab said. So I think everybody has enjoyed it, and the team behind that, they have done hard work. We will be waiting for your next session. Hopefully, most of us are around, and everybody is exciting to participate in that. So again, thank you very much. Really, it was very nice and very informative. And the way you have conducted, especially providing the recap, and that was very helpful to refresh the memory and refresh your knowledge, and especially for those who are joining first time. So it's a great really effort, great job. Well done. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Imtiaz. That's all for this evening. I would just like to thank again all the attendees for sparing your time and attending this webinar. Any updates on the future webinar or event will be shared soon on our QSAP LinkedIn page. So everybody is requested to please follow the page and stay connected. Thank you once again. Good evening. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you. Goodbye.